Great. Hello, everyone. So
Thank
you for coming. And I'll let Benny introduce himself, and then we can have Nynke. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you both.
Hi, so I'm Benny. I'm a first-year PhD student from archaeology, and today I'll be sharing with Nynke for this seminar about sharing landscape honeybees and wild bees for food security. And I will first sort of fast speed to introduce a bit of context of the history or historiography and archaeology of beekeeping, and just to contextualize and sort of provide the reason for the necessity for landscape approach to the archaeology of beekeeping. And then I move on to my own research in Kenya, so to offer the topic with an Africanist perspective. And then I'll open the floor to, well, I hand over the floor to Nynke for her research. So human has, as a species, has explored honey and other bee products for a long time. And it has been suggested that honey had played an important role in the early sort of nutrition provision for early human evolution. And it's also chimpanzees, there has been a long study of chimpanzees using different kind of pur or turkeys to access different kind of honeys. So there has been a long history of even primate bee interaction. But then the historical writing on beekeeping only started quite recently, with the first treatise on history from 1851 by this guy called Adolf Magerstedt. And the earlier writing on the historiography of beekeeping mainly reproduced the knowledge of bees and bees' behavior from the classical antiquity, from the work of Aristotle and so on. But just to summarize, the tendency in this early writing is to sort of moralize and to anthropomorphize bees, and a lot of these social discourses and ideology actually contributed to a big part of the Nazi propaganda in the 30s, as to do with the kind of the connotation of bees being loyal to the hives and diligent in working. The kind of more substantial work on the history of beekeeping started from the famous bee scientist, German bee scientist Ludwig Ambrose, and he is the first one to cite iconographical evidence from ancient Egyptian murals, and this is the earliest evidence we have for ancient Egyptian beekeeping. So he is also the one who proposed this dichotomy of horizontal hives from the Mediterranean regions and the upright hives as the skeps hives traditionally used in Europe and the UK as well. And the greatest synthesizer of the history of beekeeping is Eva Crane, on the right side of the slide. She has written a few very chunky brick-like treatises, majestic treatises on the history of beekeeping. And although she highlighted some of the previously neglected evidence of beekeeping in the past, for example, the bee shelter and the bee bows that we see all across the UK, part of France, and part of Northern Europe, like that famous bee shelter on a slide. She carried through a lot of the biases in these earlier writing of history of beekeeping, especially with a bias against Africa as being able to invent beekeeping on itself, whereas the horizontal hives that's being used in Africa is deemed to come from ancient Egypt or the Mediterranean. And the archaeology of beekeeping has really advanced from really the 80s onwards, when it borrowed concepts from prehistory, especially with the study of material production. And with the idea of chain of repertoire and production cycle, the archaeology has been able to identify different objects used in different stages of beekeeping that has unable to be identified in the past. For example, the honey jars here and the smokers on the top. These were used to fumigate the bees while collecting the honeys. and they have been attributed to different uses in the past. More recently, the archaeology has found in situ beehives in one of the earliest sites from around 5,000 years ago in Israel called Peari, and also found charcoal in individual bees. A second batch of evidence came from lipid analysis from ancient pottery remains. The lipid analysis analyzing beeswax and have found evidence of at least access to beeswax and honey from as early as 8,000 years ago. However, these approaches, they have two main issues. One is the heavy reliance on biochemical methods such as lipid analysis that is heavily reliant on the existence of beeswax. But a close reading of African ethnography on beekeeping, actually you find out that beeswax are not widely collected until the recent time, with the rising demand in the West during the colonial period, whereas beeswax were actually chucked away and honey collected in the past. And also, lipid analysis relies on somewhere for the lipid residue to stay. Mostly these are the ceramic pottery containers or beehives used in the Mediterranean beekeeping, whereas in most of African beekeepings, the beehives and container vessels are made from organic materials that's perishable and not usually being able to be preserved in archaeology. So in my master's research, I ran a Bayesian regression to compare 3 different sets of data between the Mediterranean beekeeping in, saying, ancient Greek and Roman ways of beekeeping, modern beekeeping, and the African, especially East African indigenous beekeeping from these following sites. And I compared the material, what I call the conservation possibility, by coding each material of the beekeeping artifacts with either a high level of being able to be conserved or a low level being able to be conserved. And I compared the different artifacts using different stages of beekeeping between these 3 types of beekeeping. And the analysis actually yielded, not surprisingly, that African beekeeping had a much lower chance to be preserved in archaeology. And therefore, these existing methods, approaches to the archaeological beekeeping is not really applicable to African beekeeping. And what it sort of underrepresented is a huge amount of indigenous knowledges around beekeeping, including so we see here the queen cages actually used in Ethiopian beekeeping to place new queens into the hives, and the smokers made from organic materials and branches. None of these kind of preserving archaeology. And therefore, I propose an alternative ways to looking into the history and the past of beekeeping through a more sort of landscape and ecology oriented ways, by conceptualizing this thing called beescape and taking beekeeping not just as an isolated craft to itself, but as closely related to different types of livelihood strategies, other forms of productions, and the entire landscape and ecology, from the larger scale of topography to the micro scale of individual trees, working as the hive platforms in Africa, but then also taking this idea of landscape domestication as because landscape is the sort of meeting ground of human and bees and where many of these tasks activities happen. But it's not only the landscape where these interactions and processes happen. It is also taking the concept from Tim Ingold, the weather and the climatic world, where it's the air we breathe, is the weather events that we experience. It's also where these interactions take place. So this beescape is also intending to incorporate the elements of climatic change in the past, and that's from the macro scale climatic change to the micro scale weather change and weather events. So taking these different processes, landscape ecological processes and climatic processes, and the kind of interrelationship between them, not necessarily as a static relationship, but sort of also taking this idea of meshwork from Tim Ingold as something non-static, flexible, and contingent. We were therefore able to ask questions about things like, how do we understand the history of beekeeping and the role of beekeeping in the broader landscape ecosystem management, and vice versa in the past, and how do we understand the role of beekeeping in mitigation strategies to climate change in the past, and how does that inform our future policymaking and future innovation projects regarding food production system and land use pattern and counter climate change strategies. So to illustrate some of these beescape concepts, for example, the African beehives are usually hung on the trees, and that's actually one of the ways to mitigate drastic temperature change during day and night. And on top of the trees, the beekeepers from the ethnography, what we're saying, the homeostasis is much better than just placing them on the ground. But then this also involves other agents in that entire meshwork of beekeeping, including the predators, such as honey badgers and other animals that will access the hives and honey. By placing them on the trees, that's a prevention from these predators. So another example is from the Okiek beekeeping from the former hunter-gatherer group Okiek from the Maui Scotland in southwest Kenya. And the Okiek, they live on this highland that's up to 3,000 meters above the sea, whereas they traditionally have clan territories range all the way from the top of the highlands with the open glades and moorlands down to the lower lands. And that way they manage to ensure that each clan has an equal access to different part of the forest and the mountain, because in a different part of the year and the season, the flowering and blossoming brings honey to different part of the forest. So their entire movement, mobility within the forest and the conceptualization of this demarcation of forest zones is entirely dependent on beekeeping as an activity. Whereas more recently, the external so-called many of these intervention projects, prosperity projects, brought in Western style hives that can only suit lower part of the forest, and that's causing a loss of the access to the forest as well, and more importantly, causing a loss of knowledge to the upper part of the forest. Another example is from the Njindo beekeeping in southern Tanzania. So with the Njindo landscape, they are usually agriculturalist farmers, but they rely on this entire little sort of ecosystem called the thickets. But even after 50 years that they've been evacuated from their homeland, you can still see this a circle of thickets, fallow lands, firewood lands, and thicket regeneration from the satellite images. Whereas these thickets are not where they will be fallowed eventually, but then the Njindo homelands move around the landscape, and they prefer to be on thicket margin, because thickets provide good flower resources, nectar resources for beekeeping, and it is where beekeeping are practiced. So it is with beekeeping that they navigate through the landscape, and this imprint of beekeeping and the agricultural relationship can still be seen on that changing profile of landscape change. So with my own research, I bring this idea to this part of West Kenya in the county of Elgeyo Marakwet and Baringo, and I intend to use historical ecology as sort of framing method, which is sort of a method that looks at landscape change and human landscape relationship both in the past and in the future. It's a future-looking way of archaeology that provides inspiration from the past of human landscape entanglements for our policymaking of our own time. So I intend to compare these two different landscape. One is the captured part of Cherangani forests in Elgeyo Marakwet, and the captured forest it's situated on averagely 2,000 meters above the sea. It goes much higher on this part of Charangani, and it's densely forested with large patches of original forest. Whereas in comparison, the Madagascar region that I'm also going to look at, which is also the famous honey production hub in Kenya, it's drastically different in landscape. It's mainly bushland, mainly acacia trees, and you can see the beehives being hanged on a single tree, whereas in capture rope, only one single hive is usually hanged on a tree. If you can make out that hive here. So the project intends to see how these different processes of human landscape, climate entanglement have taken place in the past and the present, and how that informs a lot of current process. So to illustrate, this is my pilot study, which I did in February. We went to the Charangani Hills and we did some interviews, but more importantly, we did a participatory map with beekeepers. So we walked with one single beekeepers to all of his hive in that one part of the forest. So you can see that this is the trail we walked along with him, and we recorded the position of the location of beehives as well as other locations in regard to that entire beekeeping industry, as places where they make hives in situ, the places where they lit charcoal and fire while collecting the honey to make the smokes, and the position where they where they store hives up to 18 years and can still be reused in these tree trunks. So it is a way to illustrate how that entire beekeeping management interfere with that entire forest management system, and also how it integrates with the local clan relationship. As we can see, this yellow shaded area is the clan territory of that beekeeper, whereas he has 50 plus hives, and some actually we have walked with him in the neighboring clan territories, and that integrates into different systems of traditional land management system and traditional inter and intra-clan land tenure system. So although that part of the forest is mainly used now for beekeeping and for grazing, the broader landscape is actually way more gazetted, and is an amalgamation of other forms of land use, including agricultural land use, mainly for potato farming, that has been blooming from around 20-30 years ago. And also in the capture part of Charangani, we can see big patches of tea plantations. So I'm intrigued to see how that entire tree plantation plays into the story. Usually what we find is it's not the tea flowers that's feeding the bees, because they wouldn't usually let the tree to flower, whereas it's these bushes planting on the edge of it that's providing nectar for bees, but also they're subject to the pesticide used. And this pesticide is causing a huge problem, especially on a higher part where potato farming is large. And many beekeepers are citing that the pesticides are killing the bees. And in the past, in the grandfather's generation, they had beehives within their home farm boundaries, whereas now they can only have them in the forest. And many older beekeepers have cited that the entire environment has gone much worse for beekeeping. Although surprisingly, that beekeeper we walked with to his hives, he's one of the most active beekeepers with more than around 200 hives and in the region. He is actually saying that the forest is getting better for beekeeping, but this is probably partly due to that the evacuation of people from the forest in 2014, and with the decrease of agriculture within the forest boundaries, it probably get better for him. But if we understand from a historical ecological perspective that human living in this forest for thousands of years, they became a keystone species that is an important part of that entire ecosystem. And the missing of human in that part of the landscape is actually causing a lot of issues, including increasing irresponsible use of the forest, illegal logging by outcomers who make charcoal and sell them to the bigger cities, and also a decreased use of the forest for beekeeping. A lot of young beekeepers started to have bees in alongside the roads. That's not ideal according to the elders. Whereas is beekeeping actually conflictory with that's land use for agriculture and potato farming? And I was enlightened by one of the beekeepers I talked with, and he was saying they can go hand in hand, and they have to go hand in hand, because that pesticide use is killing the bees, but beekeeping is also crucial for that entire landscape, through the channeling of irrigation from the top of the forest, with better beekeeping practice in the forest, therefore with better forest management and knowledge, keeping of this forest management knowledge, and it maintains better water holding capacity of the forest in rainy season, preventing increasingly frequent landslides that we're seeing recently, and also providing better irrigation in a drier season. And he was saying when he was a child, the river locally were the river level were much higher, and now it's a tiny little creek you can just cross by yourself. So it is in this landscape that this water became this sort of connecting point of potato farming from the lower part in the gullies, and beekeeping on top of the forest. So I think what's at stake here is that entire management, or the autonomy of ecosystem management, and future policymaking should actually look into maintaining a lot of these traditional systems in forest management, as well maintaining not only autonomy in managing your homestead and home farm, but an ecosystem including a lot of different parts of the landscape, channeled through beekeeping as an activity. And this sort of conflictory landscape between beekeeping and farming in a way is also seen in the UK, where we have seen an emergency of authorization for neonicotinoid-based pesticides in a row of 3 years. That's extremely harmful for the bees. But taking the contemporary British agricultural landscape as not a historical static field, but as an outcome of long-term activities of human being entanglement, the future of British agriculture should also regard the impact to the bees. And so on the right, we see this is actually extremely close to where we are. Almost exclusively, sugar beets were planted in East Anglia and in East Midlands. This is a field of sugar beets north to Ely, and Ely had a big sugar processing factory standing there from 1925 to 1984. So there has been a much longer term human bee sugar beet possibly interaction in that landscape, and that history has to be taken into account. So I'll hand the stage to Nynke now.
Thank you so much. Could you go to the next slide? Thank you. So as you could see in the previous slide, one of the news or one of the screenshots that was shown was actually the reaction from the British Beekeepers Association to the emergency authorization of the neonicotinoids for sugar beet in the UK. And they are vehemently against this authorization, as are many nature-oriented organizations, because neonicotinoids are pesticides that have proven in the lab and also in the field to be very harmful to not only honeybees, but also wild bees and other insects, and has also been known to bioaccumulate in the environment. And so just to give a brief introduction to myself, I'm Nynke, and I'm a PhD student at the Department of Zoology, also University of Cambridge. And I actually grew up in a family of beekeepers, which is really what propelled me into this field and also my interest in my own research. And so my research focuses on how honeybees that are managed by people and how they are sharing landscapes with wild bees. So to get back to the beekeepers, honeybees and wild bees share a lot of the same plights in the modern world. So they are both threatened by pesticide use, pesticides that are also toxic to insects, as well as the pests that they're developed for. They're also both declining because of a lack of natural habitat. So because of agriculture intensification and land use change, we've seen a really huge reduction in the available forage for both wild bees and honeybees. And that uniquely positions beekeepers to be natural allies to wild bee conservation. Next slide, please. Yes. And so I have some animations in my slides, which I realize is really inconvenient because I can't click. So I'll just say click when you can go to the next one. Is that okay? Okay. So in my research, I work with beekeepers, and I'm working with them because they possess a few key, very useful skills and knowledge that I can use to inform my research. Click. So first of all, they have a unique environmental knowledge. As beekeepers, we have to be really aware of what's flowering in our landscape, because that's crucial to what we will be able to harvest when it comes to honey harvesting time. So you need to be able to time exactly when you need to do your interventions with your honeybees, so that by the time that your major flowering crop is flowering, you'll be able to be ready to store all of that honey in the honeycomb, or the bees will be ready to store it all in their hives. And so, for example, you can have mass flowering of lime tree, which is the top flower that you can see in the slide, which is coincidentally also the main crop that my family focuses on when we're working in our apiary. So these are huge trees that have been planted in lanes traditionally in many landscapes to basically make a really nice grand entrance, for example, to an estate. And so when these all flower at the same time, they provide a huge resource for the honeybees, and they'll go to the flowering crop en masse because they like to go to the same flower, and they'll tell all of their sister worker bees basically in the hive that there's a really great source of nectar. And so that results in a lot of lime honey. And so you really have to plan in advance as to when you need to do what so that you're ready. So beekeepers possess a great environmental knowledge that's also really useful when we're looking at wild bees. Click. They also keep meticulous records of what's happening in their hives. And so you have years and years worth of records that you can directly relate to what's happening in the environment as well. Click. And beekeepers also are really good at building knowledge systems. So for example, here you have a picture of the Cambridgeshire Beekeepers Association one-day seminar, which happened last month. And this type of seminar is really common across European beekeepers associations. So beekeepers really like to get together and discuss all of the different ways in which they can improve their practice, the different threats that they're facing, and how to basically keep innovating as beekeepers. Next slide, please. Yes, so now there is some research, or actually a lot of research that's coming out more recently that points to potential competition between managed honeybees and wild bees. And so what we're having is a degraded landscape, basically, where two types of insects need to coexist. You have the wild ones and you have the managed honeybees. And so that's leading to some concerns about how they're sharing that landscape. Click. So one of these is the impact on pollination services. So there's some concerns that competition could lead to shifts in how pollination is delivered by wild bees. Click. And also disease transmission between honeybees and wild bees is a huge concern that people are worried that an increased stock of honeybees could lead to basically more visitations on plants. And every time an insect goes to a flower, they leave some traces behind of that they've been there. This can be in the form of feces or just a little fingerprint, basically. That can also include disease and pathogens that when a wild bee goes to that same flower, they can pick those up. And actually, flowers are then basically the intermediate between these two types of species, where you're getting infections that are spreading not only from the honeybees to the wild bees, but also among wild bees. Click. There's also concern for competition between nesting sites, and this, I have a question mark there because this is not included in this review that I included in the bottom, which is basically an issue where, because of the land use change, we're getting less and less semi-natural and natural habitats, where as a result, you have less places for wild bees to find nesting sites. And there's a key difference between the wild bees and the managed bees here, because managed honeybees don't really need to find nesting sites because they are in honeybee hives that are managed by the beekeeper. And so if you have a really good beekeeper, they'll make sure that even when it's swarming season and bees want to leave the hive to find another place to nest, beekeepers will prevent that so that bees are never without a nesting site. Click. And the last one here is the competition for resources, basically nectar and pollen. So if you have a degraded landscape, you'll have less nectar and pollen available. And that could lead to direct competition where, for example, the key difference is honeybees are social insects that live in huge colonies of tens of thousands of bees, whereas, for example, here on the picture, you can see a bumblebee. They are also social insects, and they also live in colonies, but they won't usually go over about 50 in a natural setting. And so you can imagine that that's a huge imbalance if you have a huge stocking density of honeybees in the landscape. They could be outcompeting wild bees for the same resources. Next slide, please. So we have a huge diversity of pollinators in the world. We have, of just the bees, over 20,000 different species. And we also have a lot of crops that we rely on to be pollinated by insects. I think approximately 2/3 of all of our food needs to be pollinated by insects, or at least 2/3 of the crops that we produce. And so different pollinators are better at different types of pollination. So that's due to how far they can fly, when they fly during the day, what their body is like. If they're more hairy than others, that means that the pollen will stick to them more easily. It also has to do with the length of their tongue, so whether they're attracted to certain flowers that they can actually reach the nectar of, or their diet. So we have a lot of bees that are very specific into what diet they have. So that means that they could, for example, only go to one genus of plant. And that means that we need a very good diversity and representation of all of these bees in the landscape to have a healthy environment. Click. Yes, and so to make sure that we have access to all of the crops that we need and also a healthy ecosystem, we need a diversity of bees. So I can give one example of this, which is directly related to my research on the next slide, which is the bumblebee. So the bumblebee, as well as the honeybee, are two of my study species. And bumblebees are different than most other bees because they do something called buzz pollination. And so the way that this works is basically bumblebees are able to disengage their wings from their flight muscles and vibrate their flight muscles, which causes them to buzz without flying. And other insects or other bees and hoverflies, beetles, butterflies that are also all pollinators are not able to do this, which means that bumblebees are really crucial to pollinating some of our huge crops, such as aubergine, blueberries, and tomatoes. And this is a tomato plant that you can see on the photo. So click. Yes, so that's a tomato plant, a tomato flower. And the way that this works is that some plants have different types of anthers. If you click, you can see a few different types. So the first one, you can basically see that where there's some black on the anther, that is where the pollen would come out. So the first one, you can see that there's quite a large surface from which the pollen can come out once the anther is mature. And what happens with tomato plants and also some others, you basically have something which is called poricidial anthers, which is the second one, which you can see that it basically has a small opening at the top, and the pollen won't easily come out once it's mature. And so you need an insect mediator, which you can see on the next. Yes, so you basically need a bumblebee to be attracted to this flower in the first instance. When it visits it, it'll do a buzzing sound, which is the buzz pollination. And by buzzing, it shakes out the pollen from those tiny holes. And so that's how they're able to access the pollen. And you need a variety of different pollinators to be able to get a variety of different crops. And the bumblebee is a perfect example of this. So you can go to the next slide. So this brings me to my research question and what I'm focusing on in my PhD, which is all about sharing landscapes and how honeybees and bumblebees share the same ones. Yes, I'm almost done. This is my last slide, or second to last. Click, please. Yes, so my research question for my field study is whether honeybee hive density and honeybee hive size influence bumblebee foraging behavior, fitness, and reproductive output. And I do this through three key ways. If you click, you can just click 3 times, you'll see all of them pop up. Yeah, I'll speed up. So that's through working together with beekeepers through citizen science. So I work together with them to gain access to their records, basically, of how they're managing their hives, which will give me an insight into how big their honeybee hives are and how much honey they are producing in a given landscape. And also, they're really great collaborators because a lot of them also care about other types of pollinators. So far, I've gotten a really positive response to placing bumblebee nests next to their apiaries. And so you can see that on the map is a graphic representation of what that would look like. Is you have 2 different types of sites in the same landscape that are far away enough from each other, where you have both honeybees and bumblebees. And by measuring how they're both doing, you can see the degree of competition or of resource overlap between the 2 species. And then by measuring what is in the landscape, you can see whether a higher density or a lower density of honeybees, how that changes the behavior of the bumblebees as to which species they're foraging on and how they are using the landscape. Yes, and then there's a final slide. That's just to say that humans have a really, really long history of living alongside and working with bees. This is a photo or an image, a drawing from approximately 450 years ago. And the photo next to it is a picture of our apiary at home with me and my dad in the photo. And basically what I'm trying to say with this is to tie it back to Benny's side of the presentation, where we are constantly evolving how we are taking care of the bees and how we keep bees in the landscape. And I think what could come out of my research is new ways in which we can improve how honeybees and wild bees coexist in the same landscape, while still taking care of food security and pollination services. That's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, both of you. It's really fascinating. I have lots of comments and questions, but I'd like to open up actually first to the discussion to others, and then maybe I'll reserve myself to last today. Anyone with questions and comments? I'm sure there are. John.
Hi, this question is directed, I should say, both talks were really enjoyable, really interesting, and I learned a lot. But this question is really for Benny. So you were saying how the African beekeeping methods in the past were dependent on biodegradable materials, and so in a way people are discovering that in fact the history is very, it goes way back. Is this true for any other parts of the world, do you think?
Yeah, of course. So it's not only Sub-Saharan Africa that use perishable material for beekeeping, but actually a majority of European beekeeping involved using organic materials. Scabbed hive has been used in the UK till I think in some part even till early 20th century, and you can still see quite a lot of hives in many local museums. So with my study, that when I showed, I compared 3 different kinds of beekeepings. The ancient Mediterranean ways of beekeeping also has a slightly higher probability to be conserved in archaeology, but also much lower than the modern ones, involving a lot of metal objects, plastics, and other sorts. So it's showing that African, or more precisely East African traditional ways of beekeeping has lower chance to be better archaeologically. Mediterranean beekeeping also has not such a great chance to be found out. What we see now in the archaeology with the ceramic beehives, ceramic honeypots, these are just an iceberg of ancient beekeeping industry.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Anyone else? Baron.
Yeah, thank you. A great talk. Really beautiful stuff. This is maybe a bit of a naive question. Of course, I'm following the whole discussion about this whole nicotine blockage of sugar beet, etc., and the damage it causes to pollinators, bees in this case. So first of all, when I read the research papers, but that's my personal impression, I think we have to be careful comparing the research conditions to the conditions in the field. And I'm talking about concentration-wise. I think the amount that they test on pollinators is extremely high. But what I would like to raise is a discussion with you guys on particularly the sugar beet issue. The sugar beet is not a flowering crop. So why would we be concerned about using this chemical in the sugar beet where we don't have any flowering ongoing and most probably hardly any visiting bees in the field? What's the problem there?
Maybe I can try to answer a little bit. So I think a lot of the concerns come from the mechanism by which these authorizations are being done. I think the fact that it's possible for sugar beet to get this emergency derogation maybe is also concerning to people, because it could happen for other crops as well. I think that's one concern that people have. Another concern is that while the neonicotinoids that they would use for the sugar beets are actually seed coatings in this case, which means that it's directly in the soil, is that the soil can't be used for flowering crops, where I think I think it's either 3 or 5 years afterwards, and the soil also has to be disposed. The topsoil has to be removed after the sugar beet crop has been harvested. And so that means that there's actually quite an impact on how the land is being used. And also there's a reason why they can't plant anything that's flowers after that. And basically the concern is that the pesticides that are in the soil will leach into water, or that maybe these regulations or conditions aren't adhered to as strictly as they could be. And so that poses a big risk basically to the pesticides still being exposed to the bees and other organisms, because it has been shown that it does bioaccumulate. And so it's, yeah, I think that's the main concern with this specific example.
So to follow up,
Yeah.
once we have those coated seeds with chemicals, and you say that will leak into the soil, but that prevents from years after to use any flowering. Does that mean that these chemicals are going into the plant or into the pollen or into the nectar, or how does that work?
I'm actually not sure in the case of sugar beet, but because it's touching the soil, I think that's where the issue might be, but others may know better than me.
Okay. Okay.
I think it was about something too. Benny?
Yeah, I just want to add on that. So I've read some studies about, of course, it's not the sugar beets with what the bees forage from, but these nicotinoids in the pesticides were detected from the hedges in the forest in the field boundaries, as probably might be the same story as I was talking about in Kenya, where they have these big tea plantations, where these tea are not allowed to flower, but it's actually the hedges where that might have stronger interaction with the bees and potential harm to it by the use of pesticides. And also what I sort of was highlighting is that there has been a much longer history of that landscape management with the coexistence of beekeeping, sugar beet farming, or other sorts of food production. And as I was showing from the Kenyan side, with water irrigation being that channeling point between potato farming in the lowland and then beekeeping in the forest higher up, there might be more nuanced ways of how these different projects come together, which we haven't fully investigated. And the effects of these pesticide use remains unknown without knowing much better about that history of landscape management.
Okay, thank you.
Also, wouldn't it be helpful to introduce even more good insects that could regulate the pests and therefore reduce the amount of pesticides needed? You know, introduce, I don't know, say other bugs. Nynke, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's something that could definitely be done. I think the challenge is that to do something like that at a very big industrial scale, it will need like careful planning, and it's a change in the way people manage their land, and that's always difficult to do or introduce big changes. And the cheaper something is, I think it's the more attractive. So I think, yes, it needs to be implemented carefully, basically.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I have chat we submit as a group out of it, and it'd be great if you wanted to read it. And I was at the moment there's a UKRI on land use, change of land use, and I think a really important aspect of that project the program and the various projects, I think would be actually the use of insects, so to pollinate, and therefore moving away from what you just said, Nynke, from this very large productions to smaller, pieces of land, which then can be managed in a way that can incorporate also bees and other type of insects. I'm hoping that that call for the evidence is somehow connected and there is a vision. You never know at the moment. So hopefully they will feed into each other. Any more questions or comments? You are, Alison, before we close, Barent, and a further comment, follow up?
No. I was intrigued by the story about the transfer of diseases between different bee species. So one visited, then that same flower being visited again by another, and that there might be a potential for transfer of disease. So yeah, maybe John can comment on this particular question as well. So how much do we know that bees are responsible for pathogen transfer between plants?
It's an interesting question. So my colleagues in the group done some experiments where we've analyzed what sort of viruses you find. Mostly actually, we've been looking at bees more recently, but the more mature data is actually in aphids. So we sometimes find that aphids appear to contain viruses that infect bees. And at the moment, we're trying to see if we can find bees carrying viruses that infect pests such as aphids. And a working idea, I'm not sure if I'll dignify it with calling it a hypothesis, but a working idea is that plants can act as a transfer point in two ways. In one way, they get covered in material left behind by the insects. But the other thing is that some of the viruses that we are particularly interested in, it's a group called dicystroviruses. It's just a name that reflects the structure of the genome. But the important thing about some of these aphid pathogenic dicystroviruses and leafhopper pathogenic and so on pests is that these are phloem feeders, and the phloem can actually act as a reservoir for some of these viruses. So one of the it doesn't actually infect the plant, it's just sort of sitting there, and it may even hypothetically supplement the defenses of the plant. But we are starting a project to see if we can see any sort of virus flow, as it were, from pest to plant to bee, or just by seeing whether or not these things can be found in each compartment, as it were, of this imaginary diagram of plant and bee and aphid. Basically we're at the beginning, so I have no real answer, but I think it's a very feasible idea, and I think there's in other systems there's evidence anyway. I'm probably Nynke and Benny to tell you more about that.
Okay, thank you.
But also, this is a question for Nynke actually, or for both of you. Do bees or these pollinators go, to following the question of the virus transmission, go indiscriminately to any flowers, or in fact they just choose certain flowers? Or could we kind of almost like direct them just to one flower, and therefore by doing so, could we plant there certain types of flowers in intercrop between other vegetables, and therefore just moving almost like managing them around, creating a traffic light, if you know what I'm trying to say? Is that feasible, or is it just a weird thing to say?
I think there's definitely some evidence that there's preferences for what honeybees prefer. There's this one plant called Phacelia, which I don't believe is native in the UK, but It's used a lot in like allotments, but also flower mixes and borders, and they just absolutely love it. So there's
Brasilia.
they'll just go for it because it has really sugary nectar. And so I think you can definitely manipulate the landscape. I think it's just crucial for at least honeybees that you plant a lot of one thing, in basically in patches, because they like to go to mass flowering things. For example, a tree has a lot of inflorescences, and so that's really attractive to them. But if you just have one flower, then that's not really enough, kind of to show the scale. Yeah, and because there are so many bees in a honeybee hive, they tend to go to things that have more of one. Yeah, so I think you probably could do that. It's really interesting. I haven't heard of anyone doing that, but I think the wildflower strips, for example, that people are suggesting to put next to crop fields, they have a dual purpose of providing food for pollinators, but also to harbor beneficial insects that could, for example, eat the pests that are targeting the crops. So there are definitely like farming systems out there that do use intercropping with plants that are attractive to the pest or to the predator of the pest that they want to avoid.
Yeah, my
Yes,
understanding.
likewise, chives and lettuce. Apparently, I've learned now I'm growing chives next to the lettuce because it's detracting the bed, the not wanted insects. Sorry, Benny, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think it is actually by Eva Crane, who actually compiled a few rodents and species that bee fosters across the world. So that might be one good thing to count out. So my understanding is that an individual bee will have a tendency towards unifloral. So a single bee might tend to forage on one single type of flower and then goes on to the next available flower of the same type. But then the folk understanding of this process in Africa, or at least where I work in the Serengeti, is quite interesting. People have different ideas of almost conflictory ideas on what kind of things you like to forage. They do recognize mostly some tree species in the forest, mostly indigenous trees where bees like to forage. But they do differ on whether bees like to forage on the very tree that the hive is placed on, or on a different type of trees than to the platform tree. And I think that's quite interesting how different people have different understanding of that. But the issue that exists with the recent tree plantation and tree nurseries, what the locals in especially local NGO and also recent policy documents, what they envision as the agroforestry, as to plant many timber materials like cypress, blue gums, eucalyptus. They always have been a long history of planting these so-called exotic trees from the early onset of colonial time. But these trees, firstly, they don't really flower, and they don't provide nectar resources for the honeybees. And also they are super water consuming. So that sort of ties into that entire image with irrigation and hydrology as the connecting points of agriculture and beekeeping. So some people have the notion of planting more indigenous species, and but you can see the sort of tension between exotic tree species and indigenous species in terms of providing nectar for bees.
Oh. Okay. Thank you, Benny. Oh, I'm sorry that we've come to in fact, even over the 3 o'clock closure time, and because we could go on for quite a while more. It's really
Can I ask a quick question? Can I ask a quick question?
A quick question, Alison. Yes,
just a really quick one.
I've been fascinated. Of course, go ahead.
I had technology problems, but I've just managed to get up and join. Loved your talks. I mean, it certainly makes us look at a different perspective. Really, really interesting. I guess I've got one question quickly for Nynke. I just wondered about the shift of pollinators. If you're looking at cultivated bees, for a better term, to wild bees, and you're looking at match, are you looking at things like the shift of guilds, for example, does the landscape change with the pollinators that are there? Do you find that there's more nocturnal pollinators who want to get to that nectar first because the hungry bees or the mass-produced cultivated bees that have been pumped into the area are taking, coming in for the best pickings? I just wonder whether you're looking at that at all.
That's a really interesting question. I'm not looking at that, but I think maybe I will start to, because basically how my field sites are set up is I'm monitoring how bumblebee colonies do and how honeybees do by looking at which pollen they're bringing back, but also by matching that what I have found in the landscape. But an extra thing that I have had thought of before is to do pan traps or other types of traps to see which pollinators are also out there that I'm not specifically looking at. And that would be really interesting to see if that also changes in different landscapes. But I think that might have to look into that. But it is very time consuming because you have to identify every species. And so, that will be quite difficult, which is why I haven't thought of, actually doing that. But it would be very interesting. And now you've made me curious. So maybe I will look at that.
Great. I'm glad that Alison has given you more food for thought. And I'm looking forward to the article that we're going to work on. So watch out for an article that the group that was behind the submission we're trying to put together. So looking forward to that. And thank you also to Franziska. She's been very quiet today, but she was also in the evidence paper. So thank you, everyone. Sorry that it's come so quickly, but it was a great discussion. And we're talking next week about oil palm and livelihoods of smallholder farmers. So I hope that you can join us again next Friday. Have a good weekend, everyone. And again, thank you. Bye-bye.